Let's learn about logic. Penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. Logic, another thing that penguins aren't very good at. In this lesson, we are going to look at 3 examples. It's going to include a lot of new vocabulary. So let's get ready, and you are going to need your notebook. I would like you to pause and take notes and write these new words down. So here's our first example. If you clean your room, then you can play video games. What do you notice? Well, the thing I would like you to notice is the word if and then, and that sort of format. If something, then something. That's what we're going to be taking a look at with our logic statements. So this beginning statement that the teacher has to give you is called the conditional. And the conditional uses some letters P and Q. It says if P, then Q. And it's in that format. The arrow means then. The P is called the hypothesis. The Q is called the conclusion. We're going to use this P and Q and we're going to change them around, but this is what you start with. This is what you have to be given. So what if I did ask you to switch the order? Well, it would read something like, if I played video games, then I must have cleaned my room. So this switching around is called the converse. And notice what happened with the Q and P. It becomes if Q, then P. Q, then P. So it switches the order. And here it says, if you play video games, then you cleaned your room. And we could negate it. So I went back to the beginning. If you clean your room, then you play video games. Negate it means to add the word not. So we're thinking if you didn't clean your room, then you can't play video games. When we negate it, that's called the inverse. The inverse uses this little squiggly. So squiggly means not. If not P, then not Q. If you did not clean your room, then you cannot play video games. So inverse is going to be making both parts negative. We could do both at the same time. We could switch it and make it negative. So thinking about what that looks like, if I didn't play video games, then I didn't clean my room. That's what it looks like. And this is called the contrapositive. I always remember it's a bigger word. It's kind of a compound word. So there's 2 things. It switches the order and it makes them negative. Notice the not. So not Q, then not P. So here's some notes. I'd like you to pause it here and write these down. The conditional is the statement that you're beginning with. That has your if-then statement. The converse switches it. The inverse negates it. And the contrapositive does both. Remember that the squiggly means not. Let's try this example, and as we go through it, we're also going to answer the question if it's true or false. The conditional is, if you live in Boston, then you live in Massachusetts. What is the hypothesis? This is my P. So my hypothesis is you live in Boston. We don't actually include the if word, so that's my P. We don't include the then word in the conclusion either. So my conclusion is you live in Massachusetts. This would be the Q. Is this true or false? If you live in Boston, then you live in Massachusetts. That's going to be true. Okay. If it were false, you'd have to provide a counterexample. Here's another new vocabulary word. A counterexample is a specific example that proves something wrong. You can't just say, well, then you live somewhere else. You have to tell me another state or another city. So a specific example that proves it wrong. Here are all the other ones. Remember, the converse switches it. If you live in Massachusetts, then you live in Boston. Is that true or false? Well, that's going to be false. And as soon as there's one thing that can prove it wrong, you have to consider it false. And now you have to give me a counterexample. Well, I could live in Hopkinton and then still live in Massachusetts. Let's check out the inverse. The inverse puts it back in the same order, but now makes it negative. If you don't live in Boston, then you don't live in Massachusetts. That one's false as well. If you don't live in Boston, you could still live in Massachusetts. You could live in Hopkinton. And the last one switches it and makes it negative. If you don't live in Massachusetts, then you don't live in Boston. That one is true. Here's our third example, more geometry. If a closed figure has 3 sides, then it's a triangle. So if I ask you for the converse is going to switch it. And sometimes you have to play with the grammar a little bit. If a figure is a triangle, then it has 3 sides. The inverse makes it negative, goes back to the original. If a closed figure does not have 3 sides, then it is not a triangle. And the contrapositive flips it and makes it negative. If it, let's go with if a figure is not a triangle, then it does not have 3 sides. So you're going to do a lot of writing out sentences and then answering if it's true or false. Here's a recap. Our conditional is the beginning, our converse switches it, our inverse negates it, our contrapositive does both, and our counter example is a very specific example that's going to prove it false. And you did it. Here's a piece of virtual pizza.